Hello everyone. Today I will tell you scary stories at night, after which you will not fall asleep, but we have begun. First story. One gloomy night, when darkness reigned outside the windows, and my house seemed locked in the captivity of the night, a story began that I will never forget. My parents went on an unexpected business trip, leaving me alone in the house. While the world outside my windows seemed asleep, my own nightmares were just beginning. I lay in my bed, falling asleep to the soothing sounds of rain hitting the windows. My dreams were slowly taking me into the dream world when suddenly something blocking my view caught my attention. It was a faint noise, as if something light was sliding along the floor. In my awakened mind, I first thought it was just the sound of furniture being blown by the wind. But when the noise repeated, I felt that something was wrong. Slowly opening my eyes, I looked into the darkness of the room. It was at that moment that I realized that despite the silence outside, something was wrong inside my house. In the corner of my gaze, I noticed a shadowy silhouette standing out against the background of the window, and horror pierced me like a loud scream in the night. The silhouette took the form of a long man, its contours becoming more clear with every second. My chest tightened with fear and I tried to freeze, as if movement would betray me. His face was hidden under a mask, and in the semi-darkness I could not see his features, but his gaze, directed directly at me, seemed cold and merciless. I realized that he was in my room, and my parents were far away. Panic overtook me, and my heart began to beat so hard that it felt like it would burst out of my chest. The masked man moved towards my bed, and I prayed that my scream could wake the whole world. The masked man continued to approach my bed, his long black outline darkening against the background of the window, creating an indescribable feeling of fear. My breathing became fast and shallow, as if I was trapped in my own nightmares. He slowly walked to the edge of my bed and, as if playing with me, began to study my things, turning them over in silence. I saw his dark hands move over my things, as if he was looking for something specific. I became scared not only from his presence, but also from the mystery of his intentions. My eyes were glued to this terrible masked figure, and I could not move. With every second, she became closer to my bed, and I could feel his breath flowing ominously from under the mask. Suddenly he stopped, as if something interested him. He picked up my photograph, which was lying on the table next to the bed. It was a photo of my parents and me in happier times. He looked at her for a long time, as if my loved ones were something special to him. It was at this moment that I regained the ability to move. I finally realized that I could not remain inactive. I silently began to crawl in the opposite direction to the door, trying not to make a sound. Each step was so careful that I could hear the wooden floor creaking under my feet. He was still looking at the photo, his attention completely focused on it. I reached the door and slowly turned the knob, afraid it would make a creak that might wake him. When the door finally opened a crack, I slipped out of the bedroom and ran, as if nothing had happened, through the corridor, down the stairs, and towards the exit of the house. My heart continued to beat in unison with my steps as I ran outside and screamed for help. The neighbors heard my scream and called the police. When they arrived, the masked man had already disappeared. My parents returned home, and the terrible story of that night was investigated. But the mystery of the man in the mask remained unsolved, leaving a trace of fear and anxiety in my memory forever. Second story. One cold, dark night after I finally broke up with my ex-boyfriend because he cheated, the world around me seemed even more threatening. This estranged person, whom I once considered my closest, became some kind of mysterious and sinister stalker. I returned home that night thinking that my life would finally start to return to normal after the breakup. My home seemed like the last refuge where I could feel safe. However, when I came home and closed the door behind me, I felt that something was wrong. Immediately after I entered the house and began to unbutton my outerwear, I heard a noise in the corridor. It was the sound of quiet but confident steps approaching my bedroom. My nerves tensed and my heart began to beat faster. I took my smartphone and tried to dial the police number. but my hand was shaking and I had a hard time pressing the correct numbers. At this time, the footsteps became closer, and I only managed to whisper the address of my house into the phone before turning off the sound. Footsteps reached my bedroom door, and I knew it couldn't be anyone other than my ex-boyfriend. The door opened quietly, and I saw his figure at the entrance. He was unimaginably gloomy and unrecognizable. His eyes were full of pain and rage. He came up to me and began to present his complaints to me. His words were full of accusations and bitterness. I was in complete shock and fear, not imagining how he was able to get into my house. When I heard sirens in the distance, I realized that the police were already on their way to us. This caused my ex to back down, and he disappeared into the night, leaving me panicked and completely irritated. The police arrived immediately after that, but my ex disappeared like a ghost. He was not found, and there was only fear and anxiety that he might return. This terrible night became a reminder for me of how close people can become a threat, and how destructive betrayal and envy can be. The next few weeks after that terrible night turned into a real nightmare for me. I felt constantly on edge, living in constant anxiety. My ex-boyfriend continued to stalk me, although he always left before the police could arrive. I did everything I could to improve my security. I installed extra locks on the doors, hired a security guard, and even moved in with my parents for a while. However, this did not help to get rid of the feeling of threat that he forever left in my heart. My life has become a real nightmare. I felt as if I was a prisoner of my own fear. My ex-boyfriend kept sending me threatening messages and calls, implying that he was always keeping an eye on me. I became almost agoraphobic, afraid to leave the house, and considering every stranger a potential threat. My family and friends were worried about me and helped as best they could. They tried to persuade me to go to court and get a restraining order, but I was afraid that this would only anger him even more. With each day that passed, my ex became more and more insistent. He started appearing in my dreams, and I would wake up in a cold sweat. I was afraid to fall asleep, and at the same time afraid to stay awake, afraid of the moment when he would appear again. I once believed that people could change and find a path to forgiveness and peace, but this terrible story left me only with fear and hatred. My ex-boyfriend held me hostage to his pain and hatred, and I realized that in order to find my path to healing, I would have to fight for my own salvation. Third story. One day, when the world around me seemed calm and safe, an event occurred that left a heavy trace of fear and horror on my soul. My friend, who seemed close to me, but suffered from envy and a desire to take revenge on me, invaded my life with terrifying consequences. That evening I came home, not suspecting that my house had already been broken into, and a terrible secret reigned in it. It all started when I noticed that my dear thing, which I considered a real treasure, had disappeared. My expensive wristwatch, given to me by my parents, simply disappeared from my sight. At first I thought it was some kind of accident, or I just forgot where I left them. But as I started looking for them, my anxiety only grew. They disappeared, and it became clear to me that someone was in my house, someone who knew the significance of this watch to me. However, the horror did not end here. Later in the evening, when I started looking for my beloved dog, I discovered that she was missing. She was gone, and my heart sank with horror. This dog was my faithful friend for many years, and we were inseparable. I started to worry that something terrible had happened to my dog. That's when I received a threatening message from my ex-girlfriend, who admitted that she broke into my house and stole my watch and sent my dog somewhere far away to destroy my joy. Fear completely overtook me. I immediately called the police, hoping they could find my dog and bring him back to me. My ex-girlfriend was detained, but found ways to escape justice and avoid punishment. My dear dog returned to me, but she was in terrible condition. This event left deep psychological scars on her. Although things can be replaced, the horror I experienced that night will forever remain in my memory as a terrible reminder that envy and anger can lead a person to terrible acts. After that terrible night and the disgusting actions of my ex-girlfriend, my life has become a complete nightmare. I felt constantly on edge, living in constant fear and anxiety. My dog, although she returned to me, was very scared and aggressive. We have spent a lot of time and resources rehabilitating and raising her to make her calm and safe to be around again. The ex-girlfriend fled and police continued to investigate. It was difficult and long, but we hoped that she would be found and punished for her crimes. Over time, my life began to return to normal. I moved to another house, installed additional security measures, and began to find psychological balance. My dog gradually came to his senses and became a faithful friend again. However, fear and caution remained with me. I could no longer trust people as easily as before, and this incident left unresolved trauma in my soul. I learned how important it is to guard against envy and jealousy, and how it can lead to terrible things. All I could do was hope that my ex-girlfriend would one day realize her mistakes and be able to start a new life, freed from envy and anger. But until then, I had to remain vigilant and protect myself and my loved ones from possible threats. Fourth story. That evening I returned home after a long and tiring day, and my only desire was to just relax and forget about everything. However, as it turned out, this evening was the beginning of a nightmare story. I entered my house, not even realizing that I had forgotten to close one of the windows. Tired and thinking about business, I did not pay attention to the little things that would normally attract my attention. I didn't even suspect that someone could take advantage of my carelessness. The hours passed, and I continued to spend time in my house as usual. At first, there was nothing unusual, and I even calmed down, thinking that this time I had time for proper rest. However, as night began to fall, something began to bother me. This strange incident occurred while I was already lying in bed, deep in sleep. The night had just begun, and everything was quiet, but my anxiety did not go away. I felt that something was wrong. And then suddenly, my doubts were justified. There was a quiet but distinct creaking sound under my bed. My heart began to pound louder, and I slowly turned my head to see what was happening. The black shadow, like an obsession, disappeared the moment I saw it. She ran towards the window, and I could see her disappear into the darkness of the night. It was impossible for me to figure out who or what it was. Mixed feelings of fear and misunderstanding took possession of me. I got out of bed and went to the window to check on him. Where there had previously been an open window, it was now closed. I couldn't understand what happened. How was this possible? Who or what could have broken into my house and hidden under my bed? Through all this confusion and fear, I was overcome with a feeling of anxiety and dissatisfaction with myself for forgetting to close the window. It was a warning that my carelessness could lead to something terrible. I remained in my house, huddled in a corner of the room, my eyes remaining directed towards the window, waiting to see what might happen next. I spent the next few nights worrying, but a few days passed, and the fear began to subside, allowing me to return to a relatively normal life. I began to become convinced that what happened was just an accident or my imagination. However, as the week drew to a close, unpleasant events began to repeat themselves. At night, when I was already falling asleep, I heard a creak again, and a black shadow flashed before my eyes again. It was too strange to be an accident. I resolutely got out of bed and slowly approached the window, this time making sure that it was carefully closed. My heart was beating wildly, and I felt a heavy burden of fear. What or who could get into my house despite the window being closed? The next few weeks became a period of anxiety and nervousness for me. I installed additional locks, increased security measures, and still remained in a state of tension. The mystery of this black shadow under the bed remained unsolved, and I could not find an explanation for what was happening. However, one thing was clear to me. Someone or something was breaking into my house at night, and my precautions were insufficient. I began to watch the windows and doors, hoping to see even the slightest trace of the unwanted guest. My life has become a constant nightmare. I didn't know who could be behind this mysterious shadow, and what they wanted in my house. Afraid every night and every creak, I was a prisoner of my own fear, and no one, not even myself, knew how this terrible story would end. Fifth story. One summer evening, when the heat muffled all sounds and the humidity lazily sank to the ground, I decided it was time to relax and enjoy the silence of my apartment. My apartment was on the top floor, and from my window I had a beautiful view of the street and the neighboring house opposite. There, on the contrary, there was an apartment in which a strange woman lived. I saw her from a distance several times when she returned home, and she always made me feel uneasy. Her name was Mrs. Harker. She was always dressed in the same dress, which seemed old-fashioned and did not fit into the modern style. In the evening, when I was sitting in my apartment reading a book, I decided to look out the window as usual. And this time my gaze fell on Mrs. Harker's window. She stood at her window and looked in my direction. Her gaze was empty and cold, and I felt that she was not just looking in my direction, but was peering into my soul. It was unpleasant, and I decided to close the curtains and try to forget about it. However, one evening after the evening, while I was watching TV or minding my own business, I felt like someone was watching me. And every time I looked around, I saw Mrs. Harker at my window. She didn't make a single move. She just stood there and watched. This strange habit began to torment me. I started closing the windows and curtains, hoping that this would help me get rid of her annoying attention. But even this didn't help. One evening, when I was trying to distract myself again, I heard a knock on the door. My heart sank. I walked to the door and slowly opened it. Mrs. Harker stood on the threshold. She walked into my apartment without saying a word. Her eyes were cold and impartial. She began to walk around my apartment, as if assessing everything in it. I was paralyzed by fear and misunderstanding. Finally, she stopped in front of me and said something strange. "You don't understand what danger awaits you." After that, she turned and walked away slowly as if nothing had happened. I stayed in my apartment, feeling fear and bewilderment take over me. What did she mean? What danger? This story left me with a forever feeling of anxiety and unresolvedness, and I could never again look out the window without wondering what might be hiding behind it. I spent the next few days after this strange encounter trying to unravel Mrs. Harker's words. Her warning opened the door to different interpretations, and I began to wonder if she might know something that I didn't. However, the more I thought about it, the more ridiculous the whole situation seemed. Why would she, so silent and mysterious, suddenly appear in my apartment to utter these strange words? My rational side told me that this was just an attempt to make me feel anxious and misinterpret events. However, at night I still could not calm down. Every sound, every creaking tree made me flinch. I started checking the windows and doors several times before going to bed, as if I was expecting Mrs. Harker to return. The days have become too long and the nights have become too scary. I was determined to find out who this woman was and what her true intentions were. I began to follow her, turning to private detectives and intelligence services. Little by little, I gathered information about Mrs. Harker. It turned out that she had been living in this area for a long time, but almost no one knew about her past or family situation. She rarely appears at public events, and her neighbors describe her as a loner who avoids society. My investigations have not led me to concrete answers, but every time I saw Mrs. Harker, she kept watching me from outside her window, as if she sensed that I was probing her past. This story turned into a real psychological nightmare. I didn't know what to expect, and I was afraid that Mrs. Harker might appear in my life again. My friends thought I was crazy, but I felt that despite all the logical explanations, something was not as it should be. All I could do was continue to live in fear and await the mysterious turn of this strange story. Sixth story. One mysterious night, I felt myself waking up, but my body was absolutely motionless. I was in a condition called sleep paralysis. My eyes were open, but I couldn't move and couldn't speak. For a moment, I thought it was just a strange dream, but the feeling of helplessness and horror began to grow. I couldn't take my eyes off the ceiling, and my eyes were glued to what I was seeing. The room was completely dark, and I felt something start moving in the corner of the room. It was a dark figure, vaguely human, but with absurdly long and curved limbs. She slowly approached me, making strange rustling noises. My attempts to move or scream were in vain. I was trapped in my own body, as if paralyzed. The creature approached my bed and began to lean over me. I felt his cold breath on my face and heard strange, whispering sounds that could have been words or something else entirely. Fear completely overtook me. I felt that the creature was going to do something terrible to me, and I was defenseless against it. My thoughts were confused and mixed, and I knew it was sleep paralysis, but that didn't make the situation any less dire. And suddenly, when I felt that I could not stand the fear any longer, I began to move again. Slowly but surely, I freed myself from paralysis until I was finally able to raise my hand and touch my face. The creature disappeared into the darkness, and I was able to breathe a sigh of confusion and relief. The sleep paralysis was over, but the terrible memory of what I experienced remained with me. I could not forget this experience, and it made me think about how fragile and chaotic our psyche is, especially when we are powerless over our own fears and unconscious nightmares. I spent the next few nights after that incident in insomnia, afraid of falling asleep and being trapped in my own mind again. This sleep paralysis left a huge trace of horror in me, and every night I felt the same heaviness and helplessness. I decided to study this phenomenon and try to understand what happens during sleep paralysis. Immersion in medical literature and conversations with specialists brought me only a partial understanding of what was happening. Sleep paralysis was explained by physiological processes in the brain, but its connection with mystical visions and nightmares remained unclear. However, with each new day, I began to come to the conclusion that this was just the result of my own imagination and stress. My mind, struggling with unconscious fears and anxiety, created incredible images that seemed real at the time of sleep. I decided that I had to cope with this horror and try to overcome sleep paralysis. I began studying relaxation and dream control techniques. Gradually, I learned to realize when I was in a state of sleep and immediately tried to get out of paralysis. With each attempt, I was able to gain more control over the process and prevent the occurrence of terrible visions. Sleep paralysis was no longer my enemy, but a challenge I could overcome. And finally, one night, when I found myself in sleep paralysis, I was able to come out of this state without terrible visions. Calm and control returned to me, and I felt like I had conquered my fears. Since then, I have no longer experienced sleep paralysis, and this has allowed me to regain normal sleep and peace. This experience taught me how powerfully the mind can influence our own perceptions and sensations. I realized that our minds can create horrors, but we are the ones who can find the strength and wisdom to overcome them. Seventh story. One evening, when the subway was almost empty, I decided to return home after a long day of work. Tired and thinking about a million things, I entered the carriage and chose an empty seat by the window. There were only a few stations left before my stop, and I relaxed, closing my eyes and listening to the monotonous hiss of the wheels on the rails. The metro moved forward, and I noticed that the stations passed by as usual, but something was strange. The reflection in the window showed me that there were no other passengers in the carriage. This was unusual, considering that there are usually people on the subway at this time. A few minutes later, I heard a faint rustling sound from behind. Turning around, I saw the figure of a man standing in a dark recess. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit and was holding an old, battered bag. The man's appearance was unusually gloomy and unsettling. The man began to slowly approach me. His steps were quiet, but it seemed to me that they sounded loud, like a drumbeat in my ears. I felt like something was wrong and started to feel a cold sweat on my back. The man came even closer, and I saw his face. It was pale and deathly gray, with a blank look and terrifying black eyes. He didn't make a sound, but his presence was a strange threat. I tried to get up and move to another part of the car, but my body seemed to be chained to the spot. I was terribly scared and shouted to the whole carriage, hoping that someone would hear me and help. And then something happened. The subway car suddenly stopped and the lights went out. In the darkness, I heard rustling sounds and heavy breathing of a man who was very close. I was panicked and felt like something terrible was about to happen. Finally, the lights turned on again, and I found myself alone in the carriage. The man disappeared. The metro began to move and soon stopped at my station. I ran out of the carriage and realized that my breath had frozen in my throat. This horrific incident on the subway left me shocked and disturbed. I couldn't understand what had happened and was grateful that I was able to return home safe and sound. But every time I entered the subway since then, I could not shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows, waiting for their moment to return. For the next few days after that incident, I tried to avoid the subway and preferred to use another form of transport. However, my responsibilities and work schedule required regular trips to the subway, and I could not avoid this place forever. With each new trip, I experienced indescribable anxiety and anticipation that something terrible would happen. But the days passed, and my fears seemed more and more absurd and unreasonable. Apparently, the incident in the subway was just a product of my imagination, caused by fatigue and stress. To overcome my fears, I began learning relaxation and meditation techniques to help me stay calm and feel more secure on the subway. Gradually, my anxiety subsided, and I could safely board the train again. However, sometimes, when the subway was in a dark tunnel and the lights were dim, my imagination sometimes played tricks on me. I saw fleeting shadows and heard non-existent rustling sounds, but I knew how to control my fear and knew that all this was just a product of my mind. Several months passed, and I began to get the feeling that the incident was just a dream or a hallucination caused by fatigue. I even began to laugh at myself for the way I reacted to what was happening. But one day, returning home after work and going to bed, I heard on the news about a strange incident on the subway. It appears that several passengers reported seeing a man in an old-fashioned suit who appeared to them in the carriage. Witnesses described his face as pale and terribly distorted, and all this happened at the station where I saw this strange man. This news caused me fear and anxiety, as it confirmed that the incident was not my imagination. Whoever this man was and whatever he was, he could still be wandering around the subway, and no one could explain his appearance and disappearance. So from then on, I carefully watched every subway ride and tried not to draw attention to myself. In my deep subconscious, I knew that the metro hides many secrets and mysteries that we are not always ready to reveal. 8th story. This story remains a dark spot in my memory, and I still cannot believe what happened. It all started one summer day when I decided to spend the weekend with my grandmother in her old village house. Grandma always cooked delicious food, and I always looked forward to her culinary treats. However, this time when I visited her, I found that she was especially confused and nervous. As usual, she offered me Grandma's soup, claiming that it would be especially delicious this time. I couldn't say no to her home cooking, and we sat down at the table. Grandma served me a bowl of soup, and the aroma was truly amazing. But something inside me made me feel something was wrong. As soon as I started eating, I noticed something strange about the meat floating in the soup. These were small pieces that might have seemed ordinary if not for their shape. I felt uneasy, and I took a closer look at the pieces of meat. They were oddly shaped, almost like body parts. My first reaction was denial. I thought it might be some vague remains of an animal, but something inside me screamed that this was not the case. Grandmother looked at me with a smile, but her eyes were cold and filled with mystery. She asked how I liked her soup. My heart started beating faster, and I couldn't find the words. I tried to move the bowl away, but my grandmother began to approach me. "You prepared this," she said, and now her voice was filled with terrifying confidence. I couldn't stand it any longer, and hoping it was just a nightmare, I screamed and woke up. It took me a few minutes to understand what had happened. It was just a dream, a terrible nightmare. But his realism and vividness were such that my hand trembled as I pulled myself together. It was the middle of the night, and I was lying in bed, my whole body shaking from a terrible dream. Everything was quiet, but I felt some kind of impending threat, and now it was difficult for me to fall asleep again. I had to find the courage to visit my grandmother again and make sure she was okay. The next morning, after a terrible dream, I decided to immediately go to my grandmother to make sure that she was okay. The nightmare left me with an unpleasant feeling, and I felt some fear of what might happen. The road to my grandmother's house was long and slow, and my fear increased with each passing kilometer. I couldn't understand why this nightmare affected me so much, but something about it seemed real. When I finally arrived at my grandmother's house, I was relieved to see that everything was quiet and calm. The same atmosphere reigned in the house as always, the smell of delicious food, antique furniture, and comfort. Grandma greeted me with a smile and hugged me. She was as I always knew her, kind, caring, and gentle. I felt like a fool for believing a bad dream. We sat down at the table, and Grandma began to prepare breakfast. I couldn't stop feeling bad about the dream, and decided to tell my grandmother about it, laughing at my own naivety. "Listen, Grandma," I began. "I had a nightmare about our soup. In the dream, you prepared the soup, and there were some strange pieces of meat in it." But before I could finish the story, my grandmother suddenly fell silent. Her eyes narrowed, and she began to look at me as if she saw through me. It was a moment, but it was enough for me to understand that something was wrong. Grandma picked up the bowl in which the soup was being prepared and slowly opened the lid. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were pieces of what looked like human meat floating in the soup. "It's not a dream," whispered the grandmother. It was a warning. My heart began to beat faster, and I felt a fear that was so real that I could not explain its origin. "What's happened? What kind of meat was in the soup?" Grandma looked at me as if expecting me to say something. I had to learn the rest of the story from her, and I was ready to listen carefully to her words, despite the fact that my fears were becoming more and more real. The grandmother slowly sat down on a chair and began to talk, sparkling with a look in which concern was read. "My dear," she began, "you may not believe in such things, but our family has long-standing secrets and mysteries, passed down from generation to generation. This unusual event is connected with one of them." She told me about an old custom that had been observed in our family since ancient times. Every 100 years, when a certain date came, the grandmothers made a sacrifice to the Great Spirit to ensure prosperity for their descendants. This sacrifice included meat of human origin. My grandmother explained that she had made the decision to break this ancient custom in the hope that she would be able to avoid sacrifice. She used meat that was very similar to human meat to scare and frighten me, so that I would not come to her again. "I wanted to protect you," she said, "but you came anyway. And now we have to deal with the consequences." The grandmother claimed that the Great Spirit was now furious, and he demanded his sacrifice. She said that we only had a few days to prepare for this event, and that my life could be in danger. My head was spinning with horror and disbelief. I couldn't believe what was really happening, but my grandmother looked at me with such genuine concern that I couldn't leave her alone. We decided that our only hope was to unravel the ancient records and find a way to appease the Great Spirit without sacrifice. My days spent in the village became a search, and every minute was filled with anxiety and hope for salvation. Thus began the struggle for our family destiny, and I understood that I had to be prepared for anything to protect my grandmother and my home from the dark events predicted in the ancient records. Ninth story. For a long time, there were rumors in our city about terrible events taking place in the deep forest that surrounded our small village. It was said that inexplicable disappearances of children occurred in this forest. I always thought it was just an urban legend made up to scare children. But one day everything changed. My little sister, Emily, was the sweetest and most faithful person I knew. She was a kind soul, always ready to help and support. Emily was not only my sister, but also my best friend. She disappeared one cool autumn evening when I was bringing her home after school. After dinner and homework, as usual, I invited Emily to take a walk in the forest. She always adored nature and gladly agreed. We set off laughing and chatting about school and our friends. When the sun began to set, we decided to return home. On the way back, I felt something strange. The forest became gloomy, and the silence around me became haunting. I turned to Emily to ask her to speed up, but she wasn't there. At first I thought she was just hiding to play a joke on me. I screamed her name, ran around, looked in every corner, but there was no answer. After several hours of unsuccessful searching, I realized that something terrible had happened. Panic overtook me, and I went to my parents to tell them about Emily's disappearance. We called the police, and a search marathon began. All the villagers joined the search, and the forest became the site of a massive rescue operation. Days and nights passed, but there was not a single trace of Emily. The police literally searched every part of the forest, but found nothing. Emily disappeared, as if she had simply been wiped off the face of the earth. Everyone around me thought it was just one of the many mysterious disappearances in the forest, but for me it was a bitter reality. My sister was carried away by this unknown something that now sat in the forest and waited for its next sacrifice. I couldn't let Emily disappear forever. My sister was everything to me, and I was willing to do anything to find her. My decision was made. I went into the deepest and darkest forest to explore its secrets and find answers. My path into the very depths of the forest was full of dangers and mysteries. Everything around seemed alive and mysterious. The trees were bending down, as if calling me to something, and the night was full of strange noises and sounds. But nothing will stop me in my decision to find Emily. My only source of light was a flashlight that illuminated the path in front of me. The night was incredibly dark, and with every step I felt that this place was truly special, that something ancient and dark was hidden here. Time passed, and I continued to explore the depths of this mysterious forest, but I did not find any traces of Emily. The feeling that I was not alone was indescribable. Paranoia took hold of me, and every rustle made me clench my fists. At some point, I heard a faint but distinct child's laughter coming from the depths of the forest. It was Emily's laugh. My heart sank with joy, and I hurried in the direction from which this sound came. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that it wasn't Emily's laugh. The sound became more desperate and distorted. It was the sound of laughter that pierced my bones and terrified me. And then I saw her. Emily stood in the shade of the trees, smiling, but her smile was distorted and unnatural. She looked at me with a cold, empty gaze. It wasn't my sister. Something changed her, something dark and incomprehensible. I ran towards her, screaming her name, but she retreated deeper into the forest, and every time I approached, she retreated even further. I realized that it was a trap, and that something terrible and inhuman was waiting for me ahead. My determination to find Emily was stronger than my fear. I continued to walk deeper into the forest, ready to unravel the mysteries of this place and bring my sister back. There were answers in this dark forest, and I wouldn't stop until I found the truth and saved Emily from whatever was out there waiting for us both. With every step deeper into the forest, my nerves became more and more tense. This place was not what it seemed at first glance. It was filled with fear and dark energy. But I couldn't let fear take over me because Emily was out there somewhere and her life was in danger. The flashlight's light split the darkness around me, and I saw her again, Emily, standing among the trees. Her face was gaunt and distorted, and she silently pointed at something behind me. I turned around and saw silhouettes of shadows gathering around me. These were childish figures whose faces were devoid of expression, and their eyes radiated coldness and malice. They approached, slowly, step by step, and their presence enveloped me in dark horror. Something in the depths of the forest attracted me here like a magnet, and as it turned out, it was a trap. These shadows were something inhuman, something that fed on fear and children. Emily was just another of their victims. I decided that I couldn't let these shadows take me too. I threw the flashlight in their direction and ran like never before in my life. A whistling noise echoed behind me, and the shadows swallowed up the flashlight, but they could not catch up with me. Returning to the village, I told the police about what had happened, but they could not find anything in that forest, which confirmed their belief in the existence of the legend. I was left with one goal: never to return to that ominous forest and forget the nightmare that had become a part of my life. But despite this, I never stopped hoping that Emily would return. Her disappearance will remain a mystery, and I will fight this mystery for the rest of my life to find her and bring her back to safety. 10th story. The summer was hot, and my friends and I decided to go outdoors to spend the weekend by the river, which was well known to us since childhood. This river was the place where we swam and played as children, and it always seemed to us that it carried secrets and mysteries. When we arrived at the river, everything was as usual. The water was cool and refreshing, and we jumped into it with delight. However, as day turned to night, strange things began to happen. We made a fire, gathered around it, and began to tell scary stories. The moon was shining brightly, and the river seemed like a living silver stream, playing with its melody. Suddenly, one of my friends, Mark, decided to swim in the river, despite the fact that the night was cool. He quickly undressed and entered the water, going deeper and deeper. We laughed and thought he was just joking. But suddenly Mark disappeared from sight. We shouted his name, but there was no answer. Panic gripped us, and we began to look for him along the riverbank, but there were no traces of him. Mark simply disappeared, as if he had been swallowed up by water. After some time, we heard faint groans coming from the depths of the river. We rushed to the water and saw something dark and inhuman wrapping itself around Mark, who was fighting for his life. They were long, thin tentacles, like seaweed, but they were alive and greedy. We pulled Mark out of the water, and he was pale and exhausted. He couldn't explain what happened, but his eyes were full of horror. We decided not to stay in this place and leave, because the night was too terrible. Since then, we have never returned to this river. We never found out what lies at the bottom of it, and why it is so dangerous at night. But one thing was clear: the secrets of the river were inaccessible to us, and it was better for us not to interfere with its mysterious powers.